The gavel came down at 11:40 in the morning, on the second Tuesday of October, 1961, and the sound of it was smaller than I expected. A dry knock against a folding table set up on the courthouse steps in Cascade Falls, Frost County, Oregon. 40 acres, $340. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Wayne Petrie who ran the feed store on Route 9 when he wasn't handling county business, said the number twice, like he was giving me a chance to back out of it. "Firewood price," he said, not unkindly, folding his ledger shut. "You understand that's all it is, son. Firewood price for dead wood." I had $1,100 in a coffee can under my bed, saved from 3 years of hauling hay and fixing fence for half the farms between Cascade Falls and the Whitcomb place itself, and I did not tell him that. I signed where the county clerk pointed, and I drove the truck, a '49 Ford flatbed with a crack in the windshield shaped like a lightning bolt, out along the gravel of Timber Road until the orchard rows opened up on my left, and I sat there with the engine ticking and looked at what I had bought. 40 acres of apple trees planted, according to the county record, sometime between 1911 and 1914 by a man I never met, my great-uncle's father, and left mostly to themselves for the last 6 years because my great-uncle, old Whitcomb, everybody called him that, even people who'd known him since grade school, had been too sick to climb a ladder, and then in March he had died, and the trees had gone on standing there anyway, the way trees do, indifferent to who's watching them. The bark on the nearest row was gray-black and split in long fissures, and moss had climbed halfway up the trunks on the north side. Deadwood hung tangled in the crowns like something had reached in and twisted it. A branch the width of my wrist had come down across the wagon path and nobody had moved it. The grass between the rows was knee-high and gone to seed, and somewhere past the 4th or 5th row a hinge was creaking, over and over, patient as a clock, though I couldn't see what it belonged to. I did not know yet what I was looking at. I only knew what everyone in Cascade Falls had already told me, in one form or another, over the 2 weeks since the notice ran in the county paper, that I was 18 years old and had bought a dead man's dead trees for less than the price of a decent used harness, and that by spring, most of them figured, I'd have learned exactly why nobody else had raised a hand at that auction. I got out of the truck. The frost had already silvered the grass that morning, though it was barely past 10, and my breath went up in a thin column while I stood at the head of the first row and studied it, the way you'd study a horse before deciding whether to get close. The hinge kept its rhythm as I walked, and I let it pull me down the row rather than fight it, the way you follow a sound in the dark because standing still and wondering is worse. The trees on either side of me were old in a way I hadn't expected from the county photograph. Trunks gone gray and split in places, bark curling back like paper left too long in the rain, but the wood underneath still hard, still tight-grained when I pressed my thumb into a wound. Somebody had pruned these trees once, and pruned them well. You could see it in the shape that was trying to come back through 6 years of water sprouts and deadwood, the way a good haircut still shows itself months after the barber's forgotten you. I counted 11 rows before the hinge revealed itself, a tool shed door, gray board and batten, standing half open on a single working hinge, the other rusted through and hanging loose as a broken arm. The door itself was swollen with damp and hadn't shut right in years, which was the only reason it was moving at all, some current of morning wind finding it and letting it go, over and over. I didn't go in that day. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to say I walked straight to the workbench and found what I found, but that isn't how it happened. That day I only looked, at the shed, at the rows running east toward the tree line where the ground dropped off into a gully thick with vine maple, at the standing water in the low corner of the property where the drainage tile had likely failed years back. 40 acres is a small number until you're standing inside it with cold feet and a debt of $340 you'd borrowed half of from your mother's grocery envelope, and then it is not small at all. It's stretched. I remember thinking that, exactly that word, watching the rows run out toward the fog still sitting low over the foothills. A truck came up the county road while I stood there, slowed at my gate, and idled a moment before pulling in. Hollis Bragg leaned out of a '55 Chevy with a load of pruned brush in the bed, his own 40 acres running along mine on the south side, and he didn't cut his engine when he called out that he'd heard the Whitcomb boy had gone and bought himself a firewood pile with a fence around it. He was smiling when he said it, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes he's doing you a kindness. He said he could get a fair price for the acreage cleared, that a fellow out of Salem paid decent money for stump ground these days, that I ought to think it over before I put $1 more into a place that was going to fight me the whole way and lose in the end anyway. I told him I'd think about it. I had not yet been inside the shed. I had not yet found the drawer that didn't sit flush with the others, though I would, within the week, once the frost broke enough to make the walk down there worth making twice. The rows themselves took longer to walk than I expected, 40 acres sounding like a number a man could cross in an afternoon until he's standing in the middle of it with October rain coming sideways and the trees not planted the way you'd think, not straight the way the county map showed them, but staggered on the contour of the hill the way somebody had laid them out by eye rather than by string. I counted the rows twice that first week, walking with my collar up, because the count didn't match what I remembered from the one time my mother had brought me here as a boy, before old Whitcomb's hip went, and he stopped answering his door to family same as he'd stopped answering it to everybody else. I came up with 18 rows both times. I did not yet know to look harder at the middle ones. The house itself I hadn't gone into past the kitchen, the rest of it smelling of mouse and coal oil, and a damp that had worked into the plaster from some leak in the roof nobody had climbed up to fix in years. My mother came out on a Sunday, the 17th, in her good coat, and stood in the yard looking at the barns sag, the way a woman looks at a tooth she already knows is going to need pulling. She didn't tell me not to. She said only that Vern Ackley had asked after me at the bank, wanting to know if the boy planned on farming or on failing, and that she hadn't had an answer for him either way. She went back to Cascade Falls before dark. She had the supper shift at the diner, and I had chores I hadn't finished learning yet. The shed sat downhill from the house, closer to the old well, its door swollen shut with damp so that I had to put a shoulder into it the first time, and even then it opened grudging, an inch at a time, like it wasn't sure it wanted to let me in either. Inside it smelled of linseed oil gone old and mouse droppings, and something underneath that I couldn't name yet, something like dry apple and machine grease both. The workbench ran the length of the far wall, built heavy, built to outlast the man who'd built it, its top scarred with 40 years of blade marks where somebody had squared boards and sharpened tools, and maybe, I'd come to think later, cut scion wood in lengths no longer than a man's hand. I didn't touch the drawers that first day. I only stood there long enough to note that the light coming through the one window fell crooked across the bench, catching dust that hadn't been stirred in longer than I'd been alive, and that the drawers along the bottom didn't sit even with one another, one of them shy by half an inch, like it had something behind it holding it back from closing all the way. I came back to it 3 days later, a Thursday, the 12th of October, because the first days had gone to fences, and to the well pump, and to a leak in the kitchen roof that dripped onto my mother's old cot frame, where I'd set up sleeping until the house proper dried out. Farm work does that. It lines up its emergencies and makes you forget the smaller mysteries. But the drawer sat in my mind the way a burr sits in a sock, small and constant, and that afternoon, with the rain holding off and the sky the color of skimmed milk, I went back into the shed and pulled a kerosene lamp close and knelt down in front of that bottom row. The drawer that sat shy was second from the left, and when I worked it open, it came halfway and stuck, the wood swollen tight against its runners. Inside there was nothing but a coil of tarred twine, a broken hoofpick, and a mouse nest gone to dust. I sat back on my heels, and might have left it at that if I hadn't noticed the drawer above it didn't sit as deep as the others, shallower, by nearly 2 inches, if you sighted along the bench front and compared it to its neighbors. I got a flathead screwdriver from my grandfather's, no, from old Whitcomb's own toolbox, still hanging where he'd left it, and worked at the underside of that drawer where it met the frame. There was a panel there, thin pine, fitted snug, and painted the same gray-brown as the rest of the bench, so a man would have to be looking for it to see the seam at all. It took me the better part of 20 minutes, prying gentle so I wouldn't crack the wood, before the panel gave with a sound like a held breath let out. Behind it was a space no deeper than a cigar box, and in that space, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, was a book. I didn't open it there in the failing light. I carried it out into the yard first, the way you'd carry something that might still be alive, and I held it a moment just feeling the weight of it, heavier than a book that size ought to be, the leather soft at the corners from handling, a strap gone brittle wound twice around to keep it shut. The barn cat, the gray one that had come with the place same as the Debts had, sat on the fence rail and watched me the way animals watch a man who's found something before he knows it himself. I sat down on the chopping block, the light nearly gone amber over the west ridge, and I untied the strap. The strap came apart in two pieces rather than unwinding, brittle as a dead leaf, and I set the pieces careful in my shirt pocket like they still mattered, though I couldn't have said why. The cover was blank. No name, no year, just leather gone the color of strong tea, and when I opened it, the spine cracked soft, a sound like knuckles. The first page was dated in a hand that slanted hard to the right, ink faded to rust. March 12, 1926, rows 1 through 4. Y crosses from Newtown stock, per Dawes correspondence. Below that, a column of numbers I didn't understand yet. Grafts taken, grafts held, grafts failed, kept with the same patience a man might keep a ledger of cattle bred and calved. I turned pages slow, the light going from amber to the blue that comes just before dark, and the handwriting stayed steady, year after year, 1927, 1928, small notes in the margins about frost dates and which rootstock threw suckers and which didn't, which trees old Whitcomb had grafted himself and which he'd hired done. There was a smell to the paper, dust and something like pipe tobacco gone stale, and under that a fainter smell I couldn't place until I remembered it from the tool shed itself. Linseed oil, the same oil he must have rubbed into the workbench boards year after year without ever telling anyone what he was keeping under them. I read by what light was left until I couldn't read at all, and then I sat there in the dark a while longer with the book closed on my knee, the cat still watching from the rail, the ridge gone black against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether to keep any color in it. Somewhere off past the fence line, a dog barked twice at nothing and quit. I thought about carrying the ledger up to the house right then, but there was something about sitting out there with it, in the cold coming up through the seat of my pants from the chopping block, that felt like the right way to have found it, not indoors under a bulb, but outside, in the same air the trees stood in. When I finally did walk it up to the porch, my mother's light was already off in the front room, and I didn't wake her. I set the book on the kitchen table where she'd see it in the morning, and went back out with the lantern to check that I'd shut the shed door proper, because some habits your grandfather never teaches you on purpose, you just catch them off him like a cold. The trees along the near rows stood black and crooked against what stars had come out, 47 years of standing there before I was ever born, and not one of them looked, that night, like it was worth the price I'd paid for the whole 40 acres. My mother read the ledger at the kitchen table the next morning, Tuesday, November 14th, with her coffee going cold beside her elbow and the diner apron still folded over the chair back because she didn't work until 11. She turned the pages slow, the way she'd turn through a photograph album, and when she got to the entries about rows 9 through 14, she stopped and read them twice. "He never said a word to me about this," she said. "Not once, in all the years. I told her I didn't think he'd said a word to anybody." She looked at me a while, the way she does when she's deciding whether a thing is worth worrying over, and then she closed the book and pushed it back across the table toward me, like it belonged to me now and not to her memory of him. Your grandfather kept things close, she said. It ran in that side of the family. My father was the same. Wouldn't tell you the price of eggs if he thought you'd use it against him at supper. She said it without much bitterness, just tired fact, the way she said most things about the men in that family. Then she got up and rinsed her cup and went to change for her shift, and that was the whole of it. She didn't ask what the entries meant or whether the trees in those rows were worth anything. She wasn't a woman who chased a thing until she knew what shape it was going to take. I spent that whole week walking rows 9 through 14 with the ledger under my arm, like a man carrying a map he didn't trust yet. The trees there didn't look different from the others to my eye. Same gray bark cracked into long plates, same low crooked limbs bent from decades of snow load, same black canker scars where old Whitcomb or somebody before him had cut away rot with a handsaw. But the entries had dates against them, and dates against grafts, and grafts against a name, Rouge de Cascade, written out in full the first 3 times and then just RC after that, like a man getting comfortable with a secret. I found the graft unions eventually, low on the trunks, old swellings gone smooth with age, the kind you'd walk past your whole life and call a knot. I stood in front of one of them a long time on a Thursday afternoon with the ledger open to the page that named it, Row 11, Tree 6, grafted April 1931, and I put my hand flat against the bark the way you'd put a hand on a person's shoulder to steady them, though it was me needing the steadying, not the tree. That was the same week Hollis Bragg drove out again, unannounced, his truck idling at the gate, with the engine still running, like he didn't plan to stay long enough to shut it off. He didn't get out of the truck right away. He sat there with his elbow out the window, looking past me at the rows like he was doing arithmetic in his head, and I let him sit, because I'd learned by then that a man who's in a hurry to talk usually isn't in a hurry to say anything true. Heard you've been poking around in that shed, he said finally. I told him I had. Find anything worth the trip? I said I'd found some old records. I didn't say ledger. I didn't say row 11. I've thought since about why I held that back, and the truest answer is that it wasn't a decision at all. It was the same instinct that makes a man close his hand around something small before he knows yet whether it's worth keeping. Hollis nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer and no other, and for a minute neither of us said anything, and the only sound was his engine turning over low and a jay working somewhere back in the trees. Then he said the offer on the scrapwood still stood, that a fellow out of Salem was buying dead orchard timber for pallet stock, 40 cents a linear foot, and that he could have a crew through with chainsaws inside of 2 weeks if I gave the word. Trees aren't dead, I said. Might as well be. He said it without any heat in it, the way you'd tell somebody the weather was turning, and that was the thing about Hollis Bragg I came to understand slower than I should have. He wasn't cruel, he just measured a tree the way the county measured it, the way Vern Ackley measured it, board feet and burn value and nothing else, and it had never once occurred to him that a 50-year-old apple tree might be carrying something under its bark that no chainsaw crew from Salem would know to look for. I told him I wasn't selling the timber. He looked at me a second longer than the answer required, like he was deciding whether it was worth the argument, and then he put the truck in reverse, without another word, and backed out to the road, gravel popping under the tires, and was gone the way he'd come, quick and unceremonious, leaving the dust to settle over the gatepost. I went back to the ledger that evening at the kitchen table, my mother across from me sorting through a stack of unpaid bills from the diner she didn't think I could see, and I found the entry 2 pages past the one I'd already read. April 1931 again, same handwriting, but this time a line I'd skimmed past the first time. Told no one. H. Bragg's father asked after the French wood in 33. Said I'd lost the graft to blight like the rest. I read it twice before I understood what it meant, and then I sat very still, because the lie old Whitcomb had told in 1933 was still, in its way, standing between me and the man who'd just driven off angry. My mother asked what I'd found that made me go quiet like that, and I read her the line twice, slow, the way you'd read something you weren't sure you believed the first time either. She set down the bill she'd been holding, a printer's invoice from the diner, $31 she didn't have, and asked whose father I meant. I told her Hollis Braggs, and she nodded like the name settled something she'd already half known, the way people who've lived their whole lives in one county tend to carry the shape of old grudges without needing the details filled in. She said the Braggs and the Whitcombs had never much cared for each other, not since before she was born, over water rights on the creek that ran the property line, but she hadn't known there was more to it than that. I didn't either. I only knew what the ledger told me, and the ledger didn't explain. It only recorded, the way a man writes down what he's done and not why, trusting the why to die with him if it needs to. I sat with it a long while after she'd gone up to bed. Rain had started against the kitchen window, the first real rain of the month, and I listened to it while I turned the idea over. Old Whitcomb hadn't just kept the Rouge de Cascade a secret from the county at large. He'd looked a neighbor's father in the eye and told him it was dead, gone, lost to blight like everything else that year. When 4 rows over, roots I'd walk past every morning were carrying it forward the whole time. That wasn't caution. That was something closer to a decision made against a particular man, for reasons the ledger didn't feel obligated to give me. I thought about Hollis Bragg standing at the gatepost that afternoon, asking about the timber in a voice that wasn't really asking, and I wondered how much of what he'd inherited from his father was suspicion rather than knowledge, whether he knew there was something in those rows worth more than lumber, or only felt it, the way a man feels a debt he can't name the amount of. I didn't sleep well. In the morning the frost had come down hard enough to whiten the grass past the tool shed, and I walked the rows before the sun burned it off, boots leaving dark prints behind me in the silver, counting graft unions on the old trees the way I'd started doing most mornings now, out of habit more than need. Row 11, row 12. The bark on the old wood was rougher than the young growth above it, a seam you could feel with your thumb if you knew where to look. 30 years healed over, and still, if you knew what you were touching, you could find the line where one tree had been made to carry another. The letter came on a Thursday, the 14th of December, carried out with the rest of the mail by a boy on a bicycle who didn't wait around for a reply. It bore a return address I didn't recognize at first, Corvallis, Oregon, and beneath that, in smaller type, Oregon State Agricultural Extension Service. I read it standing at the mailbox with the cold coming through my coat, and read it again at the kitchen table with my mother watching me over her coffee, not asking, the way she'd learned not to ask about the orchard unless I offered it first. The letter was signed by a Dr. Emmett Pruitt, and it was polite in the particular way of men who have never had to ask twice for anything. He wrote that the Extension Service had been informed, he didn't say by whom, though I had my suspicions that ran toward a certain gatepost conversation, that the old Whitcomb orchard might contain surviving stock of a rootstock line the college had been attempting to locate for some years, for purposes of disease-resistance breeding. He used the words, matter of some scientific and agricultural importance. He proposed a visit, at my convenience, sometime after the new year. I did not answer it right away. I set it on the shelf above the stove where my mother kept the bills that needed thinking about before they needed paying, and I went back out to the rows because there was wood to split before the weather turned worse, and because a letter from a man in Corvallis didn't change what the trees needed from me that afternoon. But I thought about it while I worked. I thought about how a man like that would look at rows 9 through 14, not the way I had come to look at them, counting graft unions with my thumb, learning the shape of 30-year-old wood, but the way a buyer looks at standing timber, board feet instead of trees. I thought about the ledger in the tool shed drawer, the pomologist's letters, the blight that had killed everything around this valley in 1931, except what old Whitcomb had hidden in these particular rows, under bark that had long since healed over the seam. I wrote back on the 17th, 3 lines, agreeing to the visit. There seemed no way around finding out what the man wanted, and no way around the fact that whatever he wanted, The trees would still be standing in these rows when he was done asking. Dr. Emmett Pruitt came on a Tuesday, the 23rd of January, 1962, in a state-owned Ford pickup with Corvallis mud still dried on the fenders, and he walked the rows the way I had guessed he would, not slow, not stopping to look at bark or bud, just pacing off distances between trunks and writing figures in a notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He wore a wool coat too clean for orchard work and shoes that were wrong for the mud, and he shook my hand like he was doing me a favor by driving the 60-some miles from the college. He talked for a while about breeding programs, about disease trials, about how the Extension Service had been chasing Rouge de Cascade stock since before the war, ever since an old report from a retired pomologist mentioned a Frost County planting that might have survived the blight years. He said the college wanted root material, cuttings, suckers, whatever could be dug and shipped, enough to establish trial blocks at 3 research stations. He said the number then, flat, like a man reading off a grocery list. $1,800 for full rights to the rootstock in rows 9 through 14, the college's crews to come in that spring and take what they needed. I asked him what "take what they needed" meant exactly, and he told me the truth, which I respected him for, even as I felt something go cold in my chest. He said the fastest way to get established rootstock in volume wasn't grafting whips one at a time, it was cutting the mature trees down to stumps and letting the roots throw suckers, which could be dug and divided within a season. He said it plainly, the way a man describes a process he's done 100 times, not the way a man describes something he thinks might trouble someone else to hear. I looked down row 11 while he talked, at trees old Whitcomb had grafted with his own hands in 1931, standing through a blight, through droughts, through 6 years of nobody touching them at all, and I thought about the ledger sitting in the tool shed drawer, and I told him I'd need some time to think it over. He said the offer would hold through spring. He shook my hand again on his way back to the truck, and I stood in the mud a long while after he'd gone, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with dollars. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the lamp, and my mother came in from her shift smelling like the diner's grill, and asked what I was doing up so late over an old book. I told her about the $1,800. She sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a while, just worked her thumb along a crack in the oilcloth. $1,800 was more money than she'd seen in one place since my father's insurance check in 1954, and she knew what that number meant to a household that had been counting nickels since October. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know yet, which was true, and also wasn't, I think I already knew, and was only waiting to hear myself say it out loud to somebody, the way a man tests ice before he trusts his weight to it. I went back through the ledger that night, past the page with the 1931 crosses, into the years after, 1938, 1942, 1947, and found something I'd skimmed over before, notes in the margins about grafting takes, percentages, which whips failed and which caught, small numbers in a cramped hand that added up, over 24 years, to a man teaching himself a slow and exact craft one row at a time. Nowhere in those pages did old Whitcomb write about cutting a tree down to get at what was inside it faster. He wrote about waiting, about a graft that didn't take in 39, and how he tried again in 40, with a different scion length, about patience recorded in ink, the only kind of patience that leaves a mark. I thought about Bragg's offer from the first week, the stump clearing and scrap price, and I thought about Pruitt's $1,800, and I understood for the first time that they were the same offer wearing 2 different suits. Both of them wanted what was buried, and neither one wanted what was still standing and green in April. Rows 9 through 14 weren't a vein of ore to be dug out, they were 47 years of somebody's stubbornness, still alive, still capable of doing what they'd always done if a man had the sense to let them. I closed the ledger before midnight and went out to the porch, where the cold came up off the valley floor the way it does in January, and I stood there a long time looking at the dark shape of the orchard, At rows I couldn't see but knew the exact number and spacing of by heart now, and I understood the decision had already made itself somewhere in me days before, waiting only for my mouth to catch up. By April, the county had thawed enough for the ground to give under a boot without cracking, and Silas Coombs came back the way he said he would, walking the 2 miles from the county road with his own grafting knife wrapped in oilcloth in his coat pocket. We spent 9 days on rows 9 through 14, cutting scion wood in lengths of 6 inches, the way the ledger said, binding each graft with wax cloth, the way old Whitcomb had done it in 1931, with wood a Frenchman had sent him through the mail. Silas didn't say much. He didn't need to. His hands remembered the angle of the cut before I did, and more than once he corrected mine without a word, just took the knife and showed me, and handed it back. I turned down Pruitt's letter in February, a short reply, 4 sentences, mailed from the post office in Cascade Falls on a Tuesday. I told him the rootstock wasn't for sale, only the trees grown from it, and that I'd have whips ready by fall for $3 apiece to any grower who wanted them. He never wrote back. Bragg stopped mentioning stump clearing sometime that spring, though he still drove past slow on the county road some mornings, looking at rows he used to call dead. By October of 1962, the orchard gave up its first honest crop in 11 years. Not a large one, 40 bushels off the old trees, but sound fruit, red-skinned and firm, the kind that keeps in a cellar through winter without going soft. My mother came out from the diner on a Sunday and stood in row 11 eating an apple off the tree, juice on her chin, saying nothing for a long while, which from her was its own kind of praise. I'd grafted better than 200 whips that spring in a nursery bed behind the tool shed, and sold most of them by November to growers from 3 counties over, men who'd heard through the co-op or through Bragg himself, oddly enough, that the old Whitcomb place had something worth driving for. I kept the ledger in the same drawer where I'd found it, false bottom and all, though there was no more need to hide it. Some things you keep hidden anyway, out of habit or respect. If there's a barn on your family's place you were never let into as a kid, or a drawer nobody's opened in 40 years, go look. Most of what's valuable in this world isn't buried treasure. It's just something somebody kept alive a long time, waiting on a person patient enough to notice. If this is the kind of story you like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what your family left standing.